Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's NAESP Webinar Wednesday, The Stickiness Factor, Embedding Restorative Practice in the School Community. At this time, I would like to introduce NAESP's Associate Executive Director of Professional Learning, Dr. Gracie Branch.
Thank you, Danielle. It's great to be here today, and this is a first for us. This is a pre-recorded webinar, and we did that because we're always looking to bring you the best resource, and today our best resource was going to be coming in from Australia. So with the huge time difference trying to schedule this webinar, we made the decision to pre-record, but I am going to be actively engaged in the chat box. We're going to be capturing the chat today, and our presenter will be answering those questions that you pose in the chat, and we will put that together as a resource when we send out the recording. So we want to thank you for being with us on this inaugural pre-recorded webinar. I did want to introduce our speaker today. We are all going to want to have her accent after this webinar. It's a lovely Australian accent. Miss Margaret Thorsborn is the director of Margaret Thorsborn and Associates in Australia. She was one of the original pioneers of restorative practices in the 90s in Australia. And she said that one of the benefits of this work has been gaining a lot of patients. She also stresses that embedding restorative practices requires a long game, which in Australian lingo means that it certainly is a process. You can follow Ms. Thorsborn on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, and I'm going to put all of that information in the chat. So without further ado, we will start our recording of the webinar. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Margaret Thorsborn and I've been invited to do this webinar for you in January about the implementation of restorative practice in schools. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I can tell you there's a huge gap between having a good idea about restorative practice and making it happen in your school. So I'm very pleased to be able to share some thoughts with you about what you need to take care of when you're doing this kind of work. I'm really sorry I can't be with you on the day. So let me just share my screen with you, and then we can get on with talking about these issues. So welcome, of course, and I want to start properly by doing what we would do in Australia, and that is to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are all working today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And to tell you a little bit about me. So I live with my husband on the Sunshine Coast in this state. The Sunshine Coast, where the little red arrow is a long strip of the Queensland coastline. Has beautiful, long and gorgeous beaches. So this is one of them I like to frequent. We also are surrounded by old volcanic plugs. These all have, European names, but as well as that, they have Indigenous names and are sacred places. I live in suburbia in the village of Buderim, and we back onto lots and lots of bush, even though we're in the middle of the suburbs. And so most days we have a small mob of kangaroos that visits with us in the mornings and the evenings and loves to graze on our footpath. And this next photo here, of course, is one of the hazards of living in this part of the world, that we have a lot of snakes. This one, though, is not poisonous. This is just a carpet snake. Very large and old one, I suspect, and the bloke in that photo is a snake catcher, and I'm very relieved that that was some kilometres from where we live in Buderim, although it was a Buderim snake. The other wildlife that is driving me nuts at the moment are our two new little Burmese kittens, and they are locked upstairs to make sure that they don't come and run riot in my office while I'm doing this recording. So far today I've had to rework my entire office and try and stop them from chewing through all of the leads that are at the back of my computer. So my husband is upstairs with them, keeping them entertained and locked up. So if we move along, I want to start really by talking about the work that has to be done around implementation of restorative practice. And I know that you will be very familiar with this Johari window, which describes different kind of approaches to managing the mistakes that young people make, whether they're little children in primary school or elementary school, middle school or in high school. On the vertical axis, of course, we have our the issue of being demanding of young people to reach our expectations. And then along the bottom axis, of course, we have whether or not we are keen to support and scaffold them through the discomfort of making a mistake and making things right. And I know that you will be very familiar with this, so I'm not going to bang on for too long, except to say that in the rollout of restorative practice across your school community, it has to be done in this quadrant. So you can't tell your school community without discussion and dialogue that this is the approach we're going to take. And if you don't, you're in trouble. So it's just, it's a huge difference between engaging people in the decision-making about whether to go forward with this and telling them that we're going to do it. So I want to start by talking about whether or not your school is ready for this. And the reason for this requires a bit of a conversation about my early days in restorative practice. So there was nothing like the heady excitement of discovering an approach that was being used in youth offending and asking a question whether or not this would work successfully in a school. The answer to that was yes, it could. And there was an enormous amount of training done in the early days and continues to be done. But over time, my colleagues and I realised that training a lot of people to do this restorative work wouldn't necessarily change the culture of the school. So having people trained is not enough. So we began to realise that what was happening was that we had, individuals doing wonderful work in their classrooms or within their respective roles in the school, but they weren't all joined up into a whole school approach, and neither was the bigger issue of school culture addressed while they were doing that. So I want to walk you through some material very briefly, but I would urge you to go to this website, Ready for RP, that I've been very closely involved in helping you think through whether or not you're ready to launch. So over time, what we have discovered too is that some schools are in an absolutely perfect place. Their work is deeply relational. They have a relational approach to pedagogy. They have a real sense of community. And therefore, the aligning of discipline, policy and procedures is not so difficult. But there are other schools who might be at the other end of the spectrum who are in a bad way, both structurally, culturally, emotionally, and they think that starting to roll out restorative practice is going to solve all their difficulties. Well, I can tell you that the answer to that is no. So let's just have a quick look at what's on this slide here. And I would hope that after this webinar is over, that you can do some more reading about this. There's plenty available. But is there an understanding amongst all of the members of the leadership team in the school that this is simply not a couple of extra tools that you have in your toolbox that you can wheel out when you feel like it, or that you have a designated restorative coordinator in your school and that is the only person who has the skills? So there are lots of ways of thinking about what it means to be restorative, but what I would like you to think about is how do I bury this work so deeply in the DNA of the school that we don't even have to think about whether we're restorative or not anymore. So the second point here is really what I referred to first, and that is whether or not the climate or the culture is right for the seeds that will be sown when you do your restorative practice. So is the environment right? Are kids happy? Are teachers happy? Is there a strong sense of community? Do you have wonderful engagement with your the adults in the kids' lives? Because if there isn't, there might be work that needs to be done. Is there an alignment with other initiatives that you do? So many schools across the world are involved in multiple initiatives. So just off the top of my head, some of them might include trauma-informed practice. It might include social and emotional learning. It might include well-being. It might be, you might be talking up relational pedagogy. You might be talking about introducing peace practice. You might be a school that's already involved in the school-wide positive behaviour supports. Now, in Australia and New Zealand, we tend to call that positive behaviour for learning. But I'm slowly coming to realise that we need to change one of those letters to P, PC for learning, positive climate for learning or positive culture for learning, because PBL places most of the onus on the behaviour of children, where in actual fact the work that has to be done at the beginning of restorative practice is about changing the mindsets and skill sets of the adults in the school community. That's where we have to start. But in any case, aside from not overdoing too many initiatives all at once so people suffer from initiative fatigue, it would be very important for you to gather your teams around you and have a think about that patchwork that you have of all of the initiatives that you do and seeing where restorative practice is going to fit. So I once was in a workshop with some school principals in Scotland some years ago, and a school principal in a primary school said, and I'll never forget this, she said, we've come to realise that restorative practice is the glue that holds everything else we do together. So that's what I mean about being buried in the school's DNA, its vision for itself and its whole sense of identity about who it is. So here's another issue here that's very important too, and that is whether or not your staff are willing to engage in another initiative and what's their experience been like of change in the past. If they've had positive experiences of change that have been well resourced and well communicated, then I think probably they're going to be more willing than not. Is there an understanding in your school community that this commitment to the journey of restorative practice is a very long game? So this is not about whether or not you've made a decision about it. Is do you know what's ahead of you? So I would think that in any school, but certainly in elementary or middle school, that it will take the entire time for a student to move through your school from the early years right through to the end, and when they transit to another school to get that journey right. So it's years in the making, and we simply cannot afford to take our foot off the accelerator. And then in the middle of that, of course, you have a changeover of leadership in the school, you get new staff, new kids, new families. So, you know, it's a little bit, for me, like marriage, really, just because you get married. And today actually happens to be our 38th wedding anniversary, so I know what the hard work is that's involved with that. But, you know, it is like getting married, so that you start out with great excitement and enthusiasm and commitment, but after the novelty wears off, we kind of forget that this requires constant attention, you know, for it to work. And then finally, one thing I would ask you to think about here is why are you interested in introducing this approach? Because if you pay attention to the why, the what and the how of Simon Sinek, being able to develop an argument for why your school needs to go down this pathway is vitally important, and staff need to be reminded about that all the time. So if I move on to your next slide, I just want to draw a parallel here with the work that's been done here in Australia with Professor John Hattie. Now, he may have made his way over the Pacific Ocean to the United States, but he talks about how important in terms of student outcomes, what the quality of teacher and student relationships are like. So this work is deeply relational work, whether we're talking about teaching or learning or nudging kids onto the path of righteousness, about doing the right thing. But I just wanted to emphasise that if we're talking about relational pedagogy, what's happening in a classroom that is high pressure and high expectations and high care is in exactly the same quadrant as the social discipline window where restorative practice fits. So I think there are many strands that get brought together with this restorative work. And if we're talking about relationships in the classroom between adults and students, I also want to draw your attention to the Search Institute material around developmental relationships. Now, some of you will be very familiar with this. It's a not-for-profit organisation in Minnesota, and this morning actually I completed an online workshop with them and was absolutely convinced, in case I wasn't before, that this work has to be done along with high performance relationships, along with restorative practice, along with trauma-informed work in schools, along with the work you do in wellbeing or positive psychology or positive, you know, school-wide positive behaviour support. These are all the threads and strands that need to be brought together. So I want you to think very carefully about how you can interweave these things to make a patchwork that is going to really change the data and outcomes for your school. So the next slide, which I absolutely love, this comes from a adolescent psychologist in Melbourne in Australia, which I think absolutely wraps up the attitude of the adult when we're dealing with young people who make big and small mistakes around their behaviour. And that is, you know, these little kind of short bursts of language are easy ways for us to remember how we have to be with young people, whether we're a teacher aide, whether we're a school principal, whether we're a deputy principal, whether we're a classroom in a teacher, or in fact a parent at home or an adult running a youth group, that when we're working with young people, we have to maintain this level of curiosity So to be curious, not furious, to explore with them rather than exploding and seeking to understand before any kind of reprimand. And the beauty of restorative practice, of course, is that the process becomes the reprimand and is the consequence. And so the process, you know, helps kids explore their why. Why did they do it? Except we don't ask why. We ask what was going on for you when you did that thing. But we ask them to think about, to be curious about the impact of their behaviour on other people and their own families, etc. So I just thought I'd include that slide because it's so cute. And then I want to bring you to the work that we started to explore in trying to help ourselves understand what we had to do to manage change more successfully. So I want to introduce you to John Cotter, and I'm sure some of you who've done your groundwork in becoming principals or doing postgrad work would have come across his work, but he has written a particular version of his work about the education sector, and I have asked Danielle to include that as a kind of handout that goes with this webinar. So step one is always about figuring out your why. Why do we need to go down this path? And look, we're all in a state of constant social evolution, and I'd have to say that young people are very much more emancipated than when I was a young person at school, when I wouldn't have said boo to a goose, where I was incredibly compliant because that's what mum and dad expected of me, that teachers were up on some sort of pedestal. Well, the pedestal thing doesn't work anymore. And, you know, if there's one thing that must compel us to do things differently is how life has changed for young people and for ourselves for that matter, but particularly with the pandemic that's wreaked havoc everywhere. So if I can just take you through a few steps, and if you can kind of check off to see that this is what you're doing. So some of you will be reassured, I think, and others of you might think, oh, I hadn't thought of that. So if we've created the why here, and you know, there's all sorts of whys. It's the changing nature of our student population. It's the data. It's about whether or not we've got truancy issues, whether we've got too many suspensions, whether or not our academic outcomes are being achieved. But all of those indicators about how we need to do things differently. And this group here is your guiding coalition. In our textbook, which I'll talk to you about later in the webinar, talks about an implementation team. So this is not something that can be done on one person's work, because if they should be run over by a bus, it will all fall over. It can't be about someone's strong personality. It needs to be a team of people. And if I can make suggestions here, there needs to be someone from the leadership team who has access to a budget and it's part of their portfolio of roles and responsibilities. You need someone who's a classroom teacher. I would suggest any welfare or, you know, you have school counsellors or school psychologists. I would suggest you include one of them. I think you need to include a teacher aide because often they're the glue that holds the whole school together. And I would also have a kind of reference group of students and a reference group of committed families too, where if you're designing something, you can actually go to them and say, how do you think this would work, right? So always designing something in a temporary way, not that it's going to be cast in stone and can't be changed. So these early stages are very experimental. But look, one of the things is really important over this side too is the link with the other initiatives that you already have going, and I've spoken about that already. But it's also about what's the vision for the school, the vision and values for the school. And what John Cotter says about this aspect of this change process is that this material, this work around vision and values, and our reasons why we're going down a particular pathway is under-communicated to the power of 10. Which means it's not good enough at the beginning of a school year for us, you know, the leadership team in the school to stand up with the brethren. We are gathered here together, and just let's remind ourselves that we're a restorative school, and then that's the last thing that anyone hears out of anyone's mouth. It needs constant attention where your expectations and support for staff are every bit as high as teachers' expectations and support for students are in classrooms. Then eventually, of course, when you start to work out a bit of a way forward, then I would ask for volunteers so that you're rolling out with classrooms and teachers who really are interested in having a go. Please don't try and target your greatest resistors. They will come on board or not down the track, and I'll talk about this shortly as well. But certainly here, the leadership team really has to get out of the way of the experiments that are happening and just let people have a go. That's, you know, and again, a reminder, it doesn't have to be, we might try this for a term or a semester, and then we'll review it and see whether or not it needs to be tweaked. Very, very important that in this experimental area that every time you have an opportunity of a gathering of your staff, that they get a chance to tell some stories about the wins they've had, because it's that word of mouth thing that will make a difference and give people a bit more courage about having a go. Now, so this would be a couple of years' work, I think, here, actually, and then you get into the grind stuff, and I think it's how do you keep this stuff topped up, and how do you embed it in such a way eventually that you don't even know about it anymore, but it will appear in policy and practice. So that's the long view, and that's why it takes so long. And I want to talk to you about another model that we developed in our book about implementation. And first of all, I want to draw your attention to the green line that is drawn across the middle of the slide. So there is a bit of a story about this, and I won't bore you with it, but there is a saying in Australia and beyond about the work that has to be done above the green line and the work that has to be done below the green line in terms of achieving the change you want to see. So if we look at what's above the line here, it will mean that people will have to rework policies and procedures. And can I suggest even changing the name of your policy to something like a positive relationships policy? Get the words behaviour management out of it, because that kind of implies command and control. Of course, you're going to have to come up with a strategic plan, you know, from 1 year to the next, maybe 3 years out, but that changes as you roll over into the next year, depending on what's happening. But the strategy has to have a budget line as well, so this can't be done without funding, actually. And the other piece of work that has to be done, of course, is to develop systems within the school with their processes embedded in those systems, and of course to provide skilling for your staff. So, for example, not every staff member in your school has to be able to facilitate a formal restorative conference for something that's very, very serious. So there are layers of skill building within a school. And again, one of the points I want to make is that if you park all of your intensive restorative skills in one person called the restorative coordinator, as much as they are gold-plated and not tied up so much with a school timetable. It is really important that the skill set doesn't rest with one person. This is whole of staff skill set. So, today isn't the day for that kind of training, but I really want you to realise that this is not one person's job. It's all of us having to share the heavy lifting. So the stuff above the line is really about how we execute the vision and values, although I always laugh about the word execution because it's hardly restorative. But what I want to draw your attention to here is the how you make it happen. So I've been in schools that have the most fantastic work that's been done above the green line, but in fact, the culture in the school is still incredibly punitive. So, the how bit is really important. So if we take a look at these three areas here in a little more detail, and probably this is the bit that's done poorly, most poorly actually in a school, and that is keeping the information up to people who you are asking to change behaviour. So they need, this is your staff, they need access to high quality information. They need to be able to access you and to talk about things that the meetings you have about the change process, need to keep them up to speed about what they need to know, why they're doing it, what difference the changes are making. To be incredibly transparent. I mean, there are some times when you actually do have to terminate an enrolment with a kid. Now, if you're in a restorative school that says we don't do suspensions or exclusions anymore, and you find that you've had to do one, you had better be able to explain the reasons for that to your staff, who will be wanting to know why you aren't walking the talk. And the other bit about this too is that if I can quote a saying from my childhood, don't let the truth interfere with a good yarn. So there's lots of rumour and gossip abounding in school communities, so make sure that your information is accurate. And I love this quote from Steve Zwieback that says, information is like oxygen. So remember what Cotter says, that your communication around the change process needs to be upped to the power of 10, and also remember that people hear the words in different ways. So just because you've said it once at a staff meeting or in a staff newsletter or send an email out doesn't mean that people have got it, or in fact that it's embedded in here. Secondly, this is really about who you believe your school is, or what you believe it stands for, what you would like to be known for. And I can't emphasise enough how important the values piece for your school is, because unless you are clear and fluent about the values that your school stands for, and that you teach the behaviours that are the evidence of the values, then the words mean nothing. You could have lovely values plaques up in your foyer of the school and have it plastered on the walls of every classroom, but unless kids are fluent and staff are fluent and they know what that means in terms of their behaviour, then you are pushing the proverbial uphill. This is visionary stuff that needs to be revisited, but certainly I would hope that somewhere in your vision is the word relationship. So it's linked to positive pedagogy, it's linked to the way we solve problems and so on, is deeply relational. And should I warn you too that sometimes using the word restorative can be the kiss of death. For schools that have started along this pathway and given up after 6 or 12 months, and they say, oh, we tried that and it didn't work. Well, their implementation was deeply dodgy if that's the case. So substitute the word relational and I think you might be on firmer ground. And, you know, this is back to what is it we want to teach kids? Do we just want to teach them how to get through exams and get into tertiary institutions, or do we want them to be decent human beings? So I think this is the development of skills for life, not just about the development of skills, for learning. The last piece is particularly important in a restorative school, because we have to kind of work hard to develop and maintain relationships of mutual trust. That is not just between the classroom teacher and students, between the students themselves, and between the administration and the teaching staff as well. Because there's often us and them sort of stuff happening. So this work has to be done at staff to staff level as well. Relationships at the core of school culture. This model value is modelled first with staff. Leadership must be and model relational. And it's just simply across the whole school community. So if you were to do a relational survey, people would talk about these things on these slides. So I'm going back to this model again, and just to maybe mention here something about the volunteer army and what we might do about the folk who aren't so enthused about restorative practice. So some of you will have met the work of Everett Rogers, who was famous for writing a huge big fat book called The Diffusion of Innovation. So if you have a large enough staff where, statistically they could fit under a bell curve, you'll notice that half the bell curve on the left includes innovators and early adopters and early majority adopters. So roughly speaking, 50% of your staff probably thinks this approach to problem solving is a very good idea. Right, but you can equally be certain that there's a significant percentage of staff that think it's a load of rubbish and is too warm, tree-hugging, stir-fried sandals, slap on the wrist with a wet bus ticket. We've got to make kids suffer. So can I just say that if you ask for volunteers, I doubt that you will get people from this section. You may get some people from here, but I would truly shoulder tab the ones here. So this is, you're looking for teachers and section leaders, I suppose, team leaders that are unafraid of taking risks, that value teacher-student relationships or value relationships as a big deal, and they are unafraid of having a go. So it's kind of like, well, it's starting to warm up here. I might just wait to see how many people are going into the surf to see whether or not the water's too cold for me, or if you're in Australia, whether or not there are any sharks in the water. And perhaps I'll stay out until, the shark nets have done their job or whatever. So the early majority are keen. Sorry, I just moved things too fast. The early majority are keen, but they need to see the work that these people are doing first before they'll be too excited about it. This is why it's important to talk this stuff up. Now, the late majority are people who are largely sceptical. It doesn't mean they're not good teachers, but they're just sceptical of this kind of approach, because I think they think the sky's going to fall in if we don't punish kids within an inch of their lives. And the late majority will typically ask the question, where is this written in policy that I have to do it? So eventually they will come to the party because as the policy is rolled out and it's mandated that they do, But we have to be very, very clear about roles and responsibilities so that in your messaging, once you've kind of got this thing moving in the school, that people are expected to do the work this way and that you will support them, but you will also hold them accountable for when they're not. Because adults make mistakes as well, and it's critically important that that we model this kind of relational accountability. The laggards, of course, and certainly in the schools that I know of so well in New Zealand and Australia, is that in an elementary school, someone who's in this last kind of little swathe of adopters are people who've probably been in the school a long time. They typically at morning tea and lunch breaks sit in the same chair and probably use the same cup. If you're listening from a kind of a secondary school or high school setting, it's chances are they cluster together in faculties. So three things can happen with laggards: that they will end up deciding that they need to move on because they can't stand the change enough. They may well end up becoming a performance issue for you, and of course the performance has to be managed restoratively. Or thirdly, and this is the miraculous piece, is that sometimes they end up participating in a fairly serious restorative and actually feel the earth move for themselves, and they will become your best advocates. So just then showing you a bit of a model we've developed about how do we, support behaviour change in the adults. It is absolutely critical that on a regular basis, and this is visited not just once a year, but at least once a semester or once a term, that people understand what their own personal professional goals are around the school strategy, or as it's linked to restorative practice, that we provide plenty of support, coaching, mentoring support for people, and that we actually hold them accountable for whether or not they're reaching their goals and supporting the school strategy. So all of that's a big deal, and it keeps us very busy. Can I recommend a couple of books to you that I know have been well thumbed over in the States, and that is a book I co-wrote with a colleague about implementation of restorative practice in schools, and I have my own copy here close. But that is really a blow-by-blow step. We'll have to re-edit it shortly because it was written in 2013, but it's pretty much a Bible for rollout. And the other thing that we realised over time too, so I worked with the wonderful Nancy Riestenberg in Minnesota and Gillian McCluskey at the University of Edinburgh with this book, Getting More Out of Restorative Practice. So it's really helping schools understand what else they can do if they're already on the pathway, and how to integrate their initiatives, under an umbrella that means everything that you're doing is making sense. So that kind of brings us to the end of the time that I have available. I'd be delighted if you wanted to get in touch with me, either through LinkedIn or through my Twitter account, or even my work Facebook page. I do have another Facebook page that I stalk my children with. But on the work Facebook page, I try and post things that are very useful for schools, particularly if you have newsletters that you provide for your parent community. So I just want to end with wishing you well and hoping that 2021 for all of us is a kinder and happier year. So I'll say goodbye with my last slide. Thank you so much for having me. Enjoy the webinar, and lots of love from Oz. Thank you.